better.
Okay, folks. Well, we're gonna continue on looking at the extracellular matrix. We briefly described some of the functions, the numerous functions it has in cells. One of the most important ones, of course, is to glue cells together to make tissues. And that was actually a prerequisite for multicellular life. You know, if you start out as a fertilized egg, you divide into cells and start to differentiate, and you start falling apart, you're not going to make an organism out of that. So that just ain't going to fly too well. So you needed stuff to glue cells together, to hold them, give them structural mechanical support. And later, of course, heavy amounts of ECM generated things that allow larger organisms and things like that. Connective tissue, think of all that sponge material that sponges are made up of. Different kinds of proteins and polysaccharides, calcium carbonate spicules, even silica spicules in the so-called glass sponges, which are ones you do not want to take and clean yourself with in the bathtub. I think that would be extremely unpleasant. Imagine how much that would itch. Tells you did it tiny, very sharp. Okay, so that type of stuff, organismal structure, what have you. Well, let's take a look at the composition of the extracellular matrix. We mentioned before that it's made up of secreted proteins and polysaccharides. We're going to take a little bit of a look at that. Now, much of the proteins that go into the extracellular matrix are glycoproteins. In other words, they have covalently attached polysaccharides, often at many different places. We're going to look at a few examples of some of the major ones. We're also going to look at a few examples of some of the major extracellular matrix polysaccharides. So let's start out. First, take a look at some of the polysaccharides. Okay, well, of course, plant and fungal cell walls, they're extracellular, that's extracellular matrix, and those are made largely of polysaccharides. Cellulose for plants, chitin for various kinds of animals like arthropods, fungal cell walls, and things like that. Some plants, the woody plants, also produce huge amounts of these multiple aromatic or benzene type rings connected together and then connected to cellulose fibers, what we call lignins, which are extraordinarily tough. They're also very hard for microbes to break down. So, and it gives very powerful structural support in terms of trees and things like that. Okay, well, so we already mentioned those, but in animals, we generally have a couple major categories of extracellular matrix polysaccharides. So let's take a look at a couple of the major ones. One of the most common kind are known as, this is a jawbreaker, folks, glycosaminoglycans. Often called GAGs for short, because the name, trying to pronounce the name will cause you to gag. Okay, now what is that in ordinary English? They are polysaccharides that are rich in certain 6-carbon sugars plus 6-carbon amino sugars. And generally they have a repeating structure where you have a 6-carbon sugar followed by an amino sugar and then repeated a number of times. So these things tend to have chain lengths of hundreds to the low thousands. Many of these things are also sulfated. In other words, enzymes covalently attach sulfate ions to them. Okay, that's a sulfate ion. All right, and we see examples of some of these things. You sometimes see in health food stores advertising for joint health and stuff like that. The stuff that's called chondroitin, it refers to cartilage. Chondroitin sulfate, you can buy this stuff in health food stores. It probably doesn't really do much except make GNC help their stock prices. There's controversy about whether this actually does any good, taking pills of this stuff. That's one thing. What's sometimes used as an anticoagulant is heparin sulfate, and there's a few other major kinds. But these are examples of these glycosaminoglycans. Large molecules, many highly sulfated, So we take a look at a couple of the characteristics of these guys. Sugars, of course, are very polar molecules, so it's not surprising that polysaccharides are polar. And heavily sulfated polysaccharides, with all those charged sulfate groups on them, are even more polar still. Now, these molecules are too large to really dissolve in water, but what they do is they soak up water like a sponge to form a fairly dense gel. So they're extremely polar molecules. For instance, if you took, like, say, 10 grams of this stuff, purified and dried down, and threw it in a liter of water and waited for a day or two, what would happen is that would turn into a fairly jelly-like suspension. They absorb an enormous amount of water, many tens of times their weight in water. And they form these kind of gels. Now think of stuff like cartilage. If you ever bit into a piece of gristle, some of that gristly thing is due to the fact that these things are loaded up with these glycosaminoglycans. So they help form dense gels. Okay, now closely related are these molecules called proteoglycans. With a term like that, proteo, it refers to something to do with a protein, with proteins, and glycans change to sugars. So what we have is a protein. It's sometimes known as the core protein. It's another name for, I forgot what it was offhand. But this protein in the center is almost all alpha helix. It's a very elongated molecule. Okay, now covalently attached to these, to various amino acids on these proteins, are going to be numerous glycosaminoglycan chains, like so. Now these structures, which look kind of like the molecular equivalent of a bottle brush, these structures are enormous. They're so large you can see them. They look like little bottle brushes under electron microscope. They may be as much as a micrometer, half a micrometer long, and they look like fuzzy bottle brushes. And here again, they're going to soak up water like a sponge to form dense gels. So a lot of what we call connective tissue in animals is loaded up with GAGs and proteoglycans. It's very common. Then it helps give the connective tissue the gel-like structure. Okay, so these are common types of polysaccharides found in the extracellular matrix of animals. We're focusing, of course, on animals here. So that's one type of thing. But extracellular matrix is also made of numerous proteins, especially glycoproteins. Glycoproteins, once again, being proteins with a covalently attached polysaccharide.